It is Mr. Greg Tosen from Da Vinci Business School. And Greg holds a diploma in metrology from the Tshwane University of Technology, a BSc in operations research from UNISA. He's got a MSc in physics from Wits, University of the Witwatersrand, and he's currently working on his PhD in developing a systemic technology road mapping framework. Greg is currently the faculty head for management of technology and management of systems, so systems thinking at the Da Vinci Institute Business School. He supervises master students in the area of technology leadership, innovation, and systems thinking. He also acts as external examiner for several universities. Greg used to work at Eskom for 32 years until he retired in 2016. He held various positions from corporate specialist to general manager in a variety of areas, including R&D and GM corporate policy and strategy. He's published over 40 articles and co-authored 4 books on environmental related research. Greg sits on a number of national and international research boards, and just to name a few, we've got the Energy Research Exchange under the auspices of the Japanese Energy Research Institute, Engineering Board of the University of Pretoria, and the Graduate School of Management of Technology at the University of Pretoria. And Greg, without further ado, if you can start presenting and take it away, please.
Thank you very much, Andres. Appreciated, and I trust you can see everything and all going well. Just to confirm, all fine there?
I cannot see your presentation yet.
Oh, you cannot see my presentation. Okay, let's go back to it. Let's see, go back to it. Okay, let's just open again. Okay, I'm sharing, open share trade. Right, okay, you should be able to see it now. All fine there, Andres?
Yes, I can see your presentation.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. Thank you. And first of all, my appreciation to the organising committee for inviting me to this conference, and it's been quite enlightening and something that Nalini's asked me to be part of. But I'm looking forward to the next 3 days of good interaction and discussion. Really today, what I'm going to do is give you almost an entree of the work that I've been involved in over the last 3 years. I've been fortunate enough to actually be involved and have discussions with about 30 of the top global utilities regarding systemic thinking, resilience, and such like. And really what I want to do is just pull out some of the key areas that I thought could be of interest to the conference members. And of course, yes, my welcome to all of you to the conference today. So really it's the review of geopolitical changes over the last decade resulting in the systemic consequences for electricity utilities. And I think it's important to understand that and how utilities think and how in actual fact politicians think in terms of the process. My presentation will have a brief introduction. We're going to look at the global trilemma, some of the geopolitical impacts impacting the utility business, and then a proposed framework, a systemic framework for resilience, and some conclusions. And hopefully it will generate some questions and discussions. I think the first thing which I'd like to start off with is what David White said, that we need to stop to change reality by eliminating complexity. You know, we need to stop trying that, because really at the end of the day, you know, we find that the standard Frederick Taylor classical management style of one good answer, one good process, we realize in this sort of chaotic and dynamic world doesn't work. And I think the concept of moving to systemic thinking in organizations need to start happening. But my presumption is that it's not moving fast enough. We still have this very, very hierarchy structure. And we find that systemic thinking happens in pockets, but not organizational wide. And why am I saying that? Is the fact that, you know, theory says one thing, reality says the other thing, and it's no different to what happens in the world today. You know, we feel safe and content with predictability. Predictability is what we want to do, and it doesn't work out like that. So really, it's important that we need to change the mindset, and in particular, utilities need to change the mindset. And my experience being within Eskom for in excess of 30 years bears strong fact to that in terms of the thinking, and it's no different to most other utilities in the world. I'd like to just really talk about a global trilemma which I think is critical. It looks at the way the world is moving in terms of a number of issues, but particularly related to energy consumption. And what I have here is a trilemma box, and on the y-axis we have domestic gross product in trillions, x-axis population, and of course on the z1 axis primary energy consumption in the standard format that is known as gigatons of oil equivalent. And I think it's important just to reflect back of where we've come from and where we're going to. The 1950s, and many of you definitely weren't born in the 1950s. And what we noticed in the 50s is that when they did the consensus, there were around about 2 billion people on the planet. 2 billion people. Energy consumption was relatively low, just under 5 gigatons of oil equivalent, and GDP low. And one can see from the pictures that we talk about technology. This was modern technology then, guys, modern technology. And the Korean War also started, and that had an impact on the global outlook. And technology was not at the level that it is today. And then, of course, we had the 2000 consensus, and we saw a increase of population, even though, very interesting enough, it took 200 years to go from 1 billion to 2 billion in 1950. It took yet a mere 50 years to go from 2 billion to 6 billion. Interesting enough, we now line at 8 billion, the world population at the moment. And so we find that the world has got richer. You can see GDP, energy consumption, of course, has increased exponentially with modern technology, with the whole communication process, artificial intelligence, and very interesting enough, even though the world has got richer, we find that poverty has increased, and poverty is increasing. We're now just almost at about 2 billion people who live on less than $1 a day. In actual fact, we're down to the level what the total population was in 1950. And the question arises with all the thinking, with all the growth of technology, and one has to look at Martek's law of technology increasing at an exponential rate. We are not creating wealth. Poverty is actually increasing. And so the question arises, what are we doing about it? And what does the future hold? I think also interesting enough, as we look at the future, and the future is very much here already, is the fact that the future predicts around about 10 billion people. And of course, the Gen X's and the Generation Ys and the Generation Zs have a different perception of the world. They are highly mobile, they are reactive, and you can see over the last decade, the last 10 years, how the concept of environment, of sustainability, of non-capitalism, if I can say that, the movement towards renewable energy has grown. And so we need to understand the complexities. We need to fully understand and comprehend the new world that is about to come along, and in actual fact, the chaotic and the complex dimensions of that new world. Very important, just to get a feel, and it's growing, it's important. However, we mustn't forget the fact that poverty is increasing, and we need to manage that as well. Right, that just sets the scene in terms of the global picture. And what I'd like to do now is just share with you the changing compositions of the global energy and relate it to the geopolitical hiccups, if I can call it, hiccups that have happened over the last 3 centuries. And it's really what I call a trajectory analysis. It's a trajectory analysis where we started back in the 1850s, where generally it was the agricultural revolution. And this trajectory analysis, one can look at this slide here. We have coal, we have non-fossil, and we have oil and gas. And we can see that during the early part of the 1800s, 1900s, the move was really non-fossil. But as we moved along, and of course with the Newcomb steam engine to really lower the water table in the coal mines, it actually started the development of coal. And of course, coal was the predominant form of energy back in the 1900s. And of course, things started moving, and you could remember and you could understand the London pollution in terms of coal, the high amount of deaths and mortalities that occurred. And then what happened is that we moved into the adoption of oil and gas. Oil and gas was moving forward, and you could see that coal also tended to decline. And by the 1950s, 1960s, oil and gas in terms of energy production was almost equivalent, was almost the same. And we found that oil and gas, particularly in the European continents and North America, what we called ushered the consumer society, the development of individuals, the development of the capitalist society, and the development, hopefully, of the growth of the economy and the global economy, even though poverty was increasing. And so what happened? What happened on the 16th of February? A very important date, which actually has changed the world, particularly from the electricity utility perspective, unsurmountable. It's changed the way we do things. And really, it's when the Kyoto Protocol entered into force. Now, the Kyoto Protocol was basically as a result of the work by scientist community. And what happened then is that the political environment took along and accepted, and not all countries accepted the protocol. But what was very interesting at the time was that most utilities at that particular period in the early 2000s were actually declining. They never accepted the reality of climate change. They looked at everything else that was not related to climate change. And they spoke about things like the molecular theory, where it was natural variation and climate change wasn't happening. And so we became very defensive and also very reactive, very interesting. And that went into place, and many countries took on the protocol and started working towards it. And then 2011, something very interesting. And of course, let's just go back here. 2016 was also very much a political reality. Hey? It might not have been, according to the utilities, a scientific reality, but it was a political reality. And it was a question of how we had to move forward. We either accept the political reality and change from a precautionary principle, a pragmatic approach, or we don't. And many utilities defended and fought against us. And there's still utilities today that have accepted it, but in a way internally rejecting it. And then 2011, another huge impact politically impacted the global utility business. And it wasn't through initially a political regime that made the changes. It was a natural occurrence. And what happened? We had the tsunami. The tsunami happened in 2011, and we know what happened in Japan in terms of the key aspects that related to the tsunami and the destruction. However, even more important, the impact that it had on Fukushima and how that nuclear plant, and we all knew at those particular time, the Japanese were world experts. They were at the top of the level in terms of safety requirements. But Fukushima had huge problems, and the world reacted very closely to that. And in actual fact, the Japanese government, Fukushima was owned by, it is owned or was owned by TEPCO, actually said to the Japanese utility market, which is about 30% nuclear, that they need to really consider closing shop in terms of nuclear power. And it actually had a huge impact on TEPCO itself. In actual fact, they almost closed shop. They were really hit hard by the political statements. They've now come back slowly again, but it was a huge impact on their business, almost crumbling to destruction. And at the same time, it wasn't only Japan that reacted to it, but of course the Chancellor, the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel coalition, announced a few months after that, 30th of May, that Germany's 17 power stations would be shut by 2022. And it was based on the fact of what happened, the tsunami in Japan. And in actual fact, in speaking to the RWE utility, there was a nuclear plant that hadn't even been commissioned. They had just built, and they had to decommission it. And what happened then is the fact that Angela Merkel felt, no, this is the way we're going to go. We're going to increase the gas market. We're going to increase. Why? Because gas emits 50% less than carbon emissions, and Germany was a huge driver for climate change. And they said, this is where we go. And again, I want to highlight, in retrospect, there's always 2020 vision. But again, I don't believe politicians think systemically at all. They are very reactive. Utilities also very reactive as well. But politicians are very reactive, and they talk to their members and they react. And of course, they moved into gas, and to the point where Germany is around about 60% of their energy is derived from gas. So they moved to gas. This is where it went. And clearly, because of the climate change, and utilities at the particular time were very upset. And of course, one of Germany's largest providers, RW, filed a law case against the government because it was that particular plant that hadn't even been commissioned, was decommissioned before it was even commissioned. And in addition to that, Merkel also had then said, we are going to close all coal-fired power stations by the year 2030. And they started closing, they were forced to close in terms of the process. So you could see what the tsunami had, not only in Japan, but the global perception of an energy form, nuclear, and how it impacted Europe. Very interesting. And how it, of course, impacted then the utility themselves. Okay, so what happened in 2018? We had a further review. We had a further issue related to climate change. And that's why I'm saying 2005 was an extremely vital day in the world from utility, where we started with the Kyoto Principle and the whole focus around climate change. The Paris Accord was then signed in 2018. Perhaps it was a little bit before 2018. But what happened is that countries looked at really been managing and pushing down carbon, and quite rightly, carbon and climate change are critical. We see the consequences of climate change, greater variability in climate, bigger droughts, bigger floods, and COP26 has just happened now. And so you could see the impact of climate change and how it's impacting particularly utility business. And then, of course, what happened? We had the elections in the US, and both China and the US are the biggest contributors to carbon emissions in the world. And of course, we then had, when Obama, who signed the Paris Accord, we had then elections in the US, and we had what I call the Trump effect, which he spoke to his members, the 73 million people that voted for him. And he said, no, we are going to use coal. And he actually pulled back on the Paris Accord, turned around and he said to the American utilities, you go and burn coal. The Ohio River Basin, Pittsburgh, burn coal. Coal is beautiful. And of course, that had a huge impact because the world and the Paris Accord Secretary General made a comment. He said, well, this could in actual fact push back the impact and burning more coal. We could get back to 1960, 1950 levels if America changes focus and moved in that area. So you can see again the impact between political statements and then, of course, how the impact would actually impact the utilities themselves. Right, and so we're here today, and today is also very interesting, highly dynamic, highly chaotic. And what do we have? We have instability. We have instability in Ukraine, and that in itself has produced not only a military war, but we have an energy war. And we can see the impact that is having on Europe as a whole. And so what are we finding? What are we finding? We're finding that Germany, who pushed, and I'm using Germany as an example, just as a point, I'm not just only focused on Germany, is that Germany, because of the ability and the need and its energy requirements was based on gas, 60%, the Russians have now started cutting back on that. And we know it's a problem. Germany has now gone to the climate change council and asked for just a retraction, a little bit of a retraction on their targets, because they have a huge problem when it comes to energy requirements, particularly over this winter and perhaps even further. Again, I want to highlight the fact that politicians are very short term. They don't fully understand the systemic consequences, the interrelationships, the relationships of a dynamic, changing world. And I find that a bit arrogant in actual fact, but this is what happens. And so what have we seen? I mean, this is a picture showing a wind farm in Germany has been dismantled to expand the coal mine, okay? So we're finding that the renewable energy is being pushed aside and looking at now moving and developing new coal mines. Very interesting. And of course, that has an impact. We say, what's the short-term impact? Are we going back to coal? Is coal king again? Very concerning, because that's the view. Because of the short-term view of the politicians and not understanding those unintended consequences, first-order unintended consequences, second-order consequences. Andre spoke about feedbacks. Yes, there's a feedback loop, a consistently and a continual feedback loop. Even interesting enough, I see that in the latest journal, 27th of September, 20 new coal plants are being resurrected to ensure there's enough energy winter this year in Germany. 20 gigawatts. Again, looking at the political implications against the utility business. And I'm not saying the utility business is also in the right place. I think they need to react as well, very much more. They need to understand the business better. Okay, and then we get onwards. We get to the future. And what is very interesting is that we notice that we see almost a return cycle of non-fossil, coal, gas, and then the view is, and this is based also on a number of energy scenarios, Shell energy scenario, where they believe that this is where we'll be going. In the future, we'll be going. But the question I want to ask, I'm not too sure. We need to understand the future. We need to understand the dynamics of the future and how we actually get there. So what have we seen? What have we seen over the last number of years? Key points. 2005, a critical point in terms of climate change, has had a huge global impact on utilities and businesses as a whole. Huge. The 2011 had a huge impact on the nuclear industry. And then, of course, 2018 was the whole concept of how climate change policies and politics impact the way coal is used for the future with the whole Trump effect. And then, of course, today, the Ukraine war, the Ukraine-Russian war, the impact that's having on the world from an energy war perspective. So the future is very uncertain, very uncertain. So the question I'm asking is, so what? How do we move forward? And the question I want to ask ourselves is, and this is my view, how are utilities managing complexity today? And the next question, how can organizations manage complexity and prepare for the unexpected better? So let's answer the first question. I think the first question is pretty unique and pretty obvious in a way, is that when one looks at the uncertainty, the complexity, the rapid change, the turbulence, the volatility of the world, and things being in obsolescence very quickly, we've seen something that happens, convergence. And this is what Corné mentioned. He said, I think he mentioned to Kim, what was his thought on convergence? And I have to support Corné here, is that the fact convergence is something which utilities and particularly organizations, because the irony of the response of companies over the past decade is to invest more and more on convergence or standardization. And I think, and it just goes back, and with all due respect to Kim, we're having consultants making a lot of money, a lot of money in terms of convergence. I'm not saying convergence is bad, but the only focus of utilities and organizations is to converge. The ISO 9000, sort of the business management processes, best standard practice. And the crazy thing is that how ironical is that our current environment is defined by volatility, turbulence, and huge change. And what is our response? Is to converge and stabilize. Very interesting. But I think we as people and people run organizations, is that our psychological perspective is, first of all, is that we rely on predictability to plan and dislike uncertainty and enforce change. So we feel that standardization is more secure. And also, very interestingly, is the fact that we feel safe with numbers. We talk about cold data and warm data. Cold data is the quantitative side, numbers. We feel very secure with numbers because we can play with numbers. And so it's important to understand that we need to realize that we cannot only use convergence and standardization. We have to look at the big picture in terms of organizations' impact and how they manage volatility and the dynamic. So the next question is, how do we think we can manage it? And I'm proposing a framework which I call a systemic resilient framework. And the framework is bound within the system, okay, within the system, in the macro and meso and macro environment, very much part of understanding the system. And when we look at an organization, it's absolutely critical that we have three domains. In actual fact, we have 4 domains. We have the future, which is at the organization level, and this is a systemic resilience, organization level, the now, which is at the operational level, and then also the third domain is at the mind, at the individual level. And I think what's important when one looks at organizational resilience is understand and try and look at the future risk, okay? Visualize them. We need to manage it and get the organization preparing for it at the organizational risk. The other domain is, I believe, is also extremely important in terms of the systemic approach, is that how do we execute at the operational? How do we actually execute those particular priorities? What are those vulnerabilities? How do we build adaptive capabilities and at the operation level and plan for the unexpected? And then to me, the most important one is the mind, the individual resilience from a systemic perspective. It's that understanding the decisions making process at all levels, because an organization is not an organization without its people, without the individuals, and continually ask the question, the consequences. Build resilience through values, mental preparedness, and understand the relationships and interrelationships. And so this is a continuous process. It's not a every 3-month process. It's a process that needs to be in place. And we need to have those transition levels. And I've identified 3 transition levels in the systemic process. The first transition process is really how the operational integrates with the organization. It's alignment and workplace integration. Critical. It's an ongoing process. It's never ending. It's not a once-off. It's an ongoing process. The individual, at transition level 2, it's engagement and performance output consistently integrated within the operational resilience perspective in the operations. And the third transitional level, which to me is perhaps the most important, is how individuals respond with purpose, making the organization agile and responsive to change. And I think one needs to understand that, because more and more we need to move it. So we need to, I believe, move closely in skillfully managing the risk of organization from a systemic perspective, because this will really become a defining competitive advantage for us. And I think it's important. And I think, what I'm trying to say is that embedded in this culture, it's not easy. It's not easy for an organization. They talk about it's easier said than done. But I think we need to move towards that particular process, particularly with the uncertainty and volatility of the political impacts of the current global perspective, and many others that impact utilities today. And one can just see it globally. One can just see what's happening today in our country, in South Africa. So, in conclusion, what have we found? We found that the world is a highly complex and dynamic system, and geopolitical impacts are extremely impossible to predict. And I have to admit, in my relationship with utilities over the last almost 35 years, been very reactive and defensive, and they need to change. They need to accept reality and move away from only convergence and standardization. And so we see clear interdependent relationships. And I believe that organizations, for them to succeed and remain relevant, is to embrace uncertainty. Important. And organizations need to rise up to the challenge of systemic resilience, covering those various domains. I thank you all for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greg. I think this was really an eye-opener. Fascinating stuff. I work for a company. I had to go through quite a traumatic event through the year. And maybe a comment from that perspective is, I think the fact that we run the company as a problem-solving entity rather than anything else, because what we ask is, what is your problem, rather than, what have you done right or wrong? We just want to know what your problem is, because then you've got a job to do to solve it. We're going to give, we have enough time for about 3 questions. So if there's anybody who's got a question, just raise your hand. And if I see it, I'll call on you.
Andres, I see Naledi has made a comment. How can academic institutions prepare students to better handle the complexities in their work environment? And I think it's a really important question, Naledi, because I don't believe that universities are doing enough. And I honestly believe that institutions like yours and Pretoria University, which I also, Andres and co, sit on, it's in terms of systems thinking and system dynamics, is the fact that we need to somehow work with universities and not textbook styles. We know we need to use, and I'm talking about mode 2 thinking, mode 2 learning. Mode 2 learning is taking realities of organizations and bring them in as case studies and work them and unpack them. And the more we do that, and the more we bring in appropriate people to drive that process, I think the more the concept of systemic thinking, understanding complexities, and looking at how we can actually manage it, because really the world today is complex. In actual fact, our families are complex. It's not just the world. The world is abound with complexities. And I mean, of course, we all know Snowden's Cynefin model. And we need to understand complexities and not make complex problems tame or simple problems. I think it's a learning process, and maybe it's something we need to actually work on and develop, because I don't think we're doing enough of that. I don't think we spend enough time developing and training students and them understanding the reality of complexity.
Thanks, Greg.
Corné.
Yeah, Corné.
Thank you, Greg. Wow, this is a really, really good presentation. And I think you're talking about a lot of things that I've been thinking about the past few weeks and months, actually, almost maybe a year. But my question is, like, facing uncertainty feels very scary. Can you share with us maybe a story or a simple journey where you faced uncertainty and it was maybe scary, but something happened when you faced it?
Okay, that's an interesting one. It was, let me tell you what and perhaps it's a time when and I'm going back, and perhaps it's an Eskom incident. I'll go back because it was which profoundly impacted me, and when I reflect back on that, it wasn't complexity. It was a case of, well, my perception that people didn't understand it, and they didn't understand the complexity of the nature. I want to go back 20 years. And 20 years is a long time, eh? Eskom those days was producing electricity, eh? And not like now, and I see I have load shedding. Is the fact that we went to board. I had to go to board, and the then specialist, and we were looking at renewable energy. 20 years ago, we actually, when I was in R&D, we said, guys, we need to start looking at renewable. We need to change our view of renewable and what we need to do. And we went in with a huge 2-3 billion rand proposal. Those days was a lot of money. It was about 2 billion rand. And it was to produce round about 200-300, it was about 2 billion, about 200-300 megawatts of renewable energy. And the view of, let me tell you, the view of the majority of Eskom as well as the board was the fact that we don't need this. And I was perplexed and complex, because the fact of the matter was, and I actually at that time I did a risk analysis and showing you that, guys, you know, the impact and the likelihood is going to be huge impact to the organization. And it was a process where I was almost, use the expression, nailed to the cross at the board meeting, because I was put aside and say, no, we don't need this. Coal is king. This is where we go. And it was this denial process that renewables are not where to go. And we know renewables have complexities. We understand renewables need as not a base load process until we get appropriate huge battery storage or huge storage systems. And I went back 3 or 4 times over a matter of 5 years, and I could never understand why it was never accepted, to the detriment of today. You see what's happening. Eskom has just now proposed a 3 or 4 or 5 billion rand program just to produce 150 megawatts, I think, at one of the plants, Kamati. Just think about what would have happened if we had already installed it. Now, to me, that was complexity in my own mind. I couldn't fully comprehend the reason why this happened. Corné, that's the best I can give offhand.
Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you, Greg. We've got time for one more question or comment.
Just Liesel, yes, I saw your comment.
Yes.
Go for it, Liesel. Lisa.
Thank you, Greg. I would wonder, if you stand back from everything that you have told us now, what would be your advice to, on the one hand, I wanna ask to Eskom, and maybe on the other hand, the people in the room and whichever industries they represent. But in the wisdom of what you've said, what is your advice to us?
Well, Leo, seeing that you are in the Department of Risk and Resilience, and we started that many years ago, hey, with Rob and you guys, and I think I almost feel sorry for you at times in Eskom, but hopefully things are moving forward there. My view is that one advice is that I think organizations today, I think that the biggest problem, and this is my perception, is the fact that we're very hierarchy in structure. We don't have this, we almost need, we talk about hierarchical, where you look at push down accountability and decision making. We talk like that, but we don't do that. And so the concept of uncertainty and the unintended consequences of our decision, we just don't seem to comprehend it. We applying the classical Taylorism management style of there's only one good solution, and we don't talk about the concept of equifinality in terms of there's a number, let's look at them. I don't believe we fully embrace uncertainty. We are so fixated on predictability. And I see your comment. Complexity is not a problem, but an opportunity to embrace. Yes, I agree with you. But we need to understand the complexity to create the opportunity. And I think that the threat of systemic thinking in organization is a threat to the leaders because they feel disempowered. Systems thinking, a systemic organization is not disempowering people. It's making leaders servant leaders. It makes them utilizing the great resource that they have within the organization, and executives are not doing that. They're not doing that. They just don't have that. They don't have that process. Corné, I see you. Sorry, Liesl, do you want to carry on?
No. I'll just put the definition of equifinality because I didn't know that word.
Okay. Yeah, so there could be many good solutions. Some solutions could be just better than other, Corné. Lisa, any you want to comment, Lisa? Any comment? Any further?
So Greg, I think
yes.
Finally, just one word from me. I think you hit the nail on the head accidentally when you spoke about what the university should do, because I think it should be less of academic lecturing and more of training, which has much more of a practical business value approach than what an academic lecture would have, where it becomes a hand-on problem-solving education process.
Totally agree with you. Totally agree with you, Andries, and I think we need more of that.
Cool. Then, Greg, thank you very much for this presentation. We'll push on your button again when we need an interesting presentation about what the next 50 years hold.